Hello and welcome to Others of Harbour. It is now September, so we're doing the books of August, and we've got this many here. All looks right, yeah. Very psychological books I felt this month, so lots of thinking about people and personalities and how people become who they are or why they are the way they're like. Often quite heavy reading, but also enjoyable for me. Like, I feel like a lot of these books, to me, are things that I would normally seek out aside from the strange challenge things. So we'll begin with book number 1 is Lila by Marilynne Robinson. Now this is book number 3 of the Gilead novels. There's 4 of them in total, and they follow the people in the lives of Reverend John Ames, who is this preacher in Iowa, set around it really chronicles his life all the way through the late 1800s to the mid 1900s. This one follows his second wife. So Lila is originally a homeless person who's traveling across America in the Great Depression, and she ends up finding work in Iowa, meets John Ames after John Ames has become a widower, and then comes to his congregation, converts to Christianity, and becomes his wife. And when I read Gilead, this was 4 years ago now, I must not have been paying too much attention because I didn't really get much of Lila's backstory from that first novel, and this novel really fleshes that out. So it's from Lila's perspective, is first person, but it is a recount, and it's interesting in the grand scheme of like the Gilead series and Marilynne Robinson as a writer. It's good. Like, I really like her writing style. It's very naturalistic, technique-y, explores human beings really well, creates wonderful character voices, lots of really well thought out emotional moments, and this book is written in exactly the same way. So all the things I admire about the previous ones, I also like about this. The issue with this one though is that it's a bit more of a tropey, well no it's not, it explores a character from a more disadvantaged background than the other novels do, and I find the issue with these kinds of narratives, now normally I really don't like them when a novel shows the kind of arc of a character being, I guess, rescued from a disenfranchised situation. Now Lila is a character, we follow her from the very childhood. She runs away from her family. She's raised by this homeless person named Dole, who is a real survivalist. Like, Dole's knife becomes a keepsake that Lila keeps throughout the whole novel because it's something that represents her attitude towards life that Dole instilled into Lila, this idea of survival and violence when necessary, self-protection, and quite the sense of like pragmatism and ruthlessness, which clashes initially against John Ames being very open and very vulnerable in his meaning of Lila. This kind of narrative, to me, is always... It doesn't often ring true because it feels just sometimes a bit too convenient. Like, it feels like it's to the benefit of the person giving the help rather than the person receiving the help. Like, I realize that the thing I don't like about this trope and any kind of rescue a character from a bad situation, like rescue the vulnerable person from a bad situation kind of trope, is that it's designed to make you feel good, but it often, to me, doesn't feel very genuine. It feels very forced or contrived. And this book, it doesn't have that problem, but as I was reading it, I still had those same reservations about the trope because I hadn't seen Marilynne Robinson write a character like Lila before, someone who is more pragmatic and someone who has been hurt before. A lot of her other characters are a bit more straightforward and rounded. And so, as much as I trusted her to convey emotion and to use language beautifully, and she does still do that, I don't know if I trust the idea of lived experience of disadvantage. And so it made the voice of Lila feel just more of a construction in my head than it did with John Ames or Glory or Jack in Home, or any of the characters in Housekeeping, because this one, it reminded me more often that I was reading a book, and I don't often like that. Now, from a raw technique perspective, I still think this is really, really good. And it's more of a simple narrative. It can be read without Gilead or Home. They don't really follow each other in terms of plot, but it is worthwhile to know who the characters are because they get mentioned pretty easily, pretty often. The timeline too, now this book was the first one in the series to really remind me of how non-linear it is. So both Gilead and Home are also very non-linear novels, but because Gilead is letters and because Home is a simple recount, it was easier to follow the timeline. Whereas here, the one thing that sets this book's timeline apart is that Lila often uses hypotheticals to jump back and forth in time. So various things happen. There's various stages of Lila's life. She lives in certain cities for certain periods of time. She stays with certain people for certain periods of time. And we jump back and forth between them. But she'll often say things like, if this person were here during this time. Or she'll imagine someone like Dole or someone like the Ellie from the past physically being present and haunting them in her future existence with John Ames. This can get somewhat confusing, and so it made reading this a lot slower than I normally would. I also just wanted to try and enjoy it the best that I can. I really like Marilynne Robinson. I still say she's probably, if not my favorite, then at least my top 3 writers, just based on how strong her housekeeping and Gilead were. So it feels harsh of me to even give it a 4 out of 5, because I think if any other author had penned this work, I might have even responded to it better. But following how beautiful Gilead was and how emotionally affecting Home was, Lila is good, but as I was reading it, I had more reservations. I think of this as a novel with a much stronger feminine voice. It has a maternal relationship between Lila and Dole as one of the core focuses of the novel. And when John Ames gets introduced, it's very much a contrasting party to the initial construction. And so maybe I find that just a bit harder to relate to personally compared to Home as well. So I do want to raise that possibility. I think it's a well-constructed book and a very well-done book. But I have my reservations. I've hopefully expressed it as well as I can. I do really want to read Jack. I am going to finish this series this year, and it's been a very fruitful journey, I feel like. I've gained a lot. I've learned a lot about humanity. It's good. I would recommend it. So. Book number 2 is called Comfort Farm. This is my Make Me Laugh of August. So this often gets cited as one of the greatest comic novels of all time, and I bounced the hell off this the first time I read it, because I read, and it says everywhere, it's a parody of pastoral romances that were popular in the 1900s. I had foolishly thought that this included D.H. Lawrence, which it doesn't. D.H. Lawrence is much more of a psychological writer. The pastoral romances that were popular in the 1900s don't get talked about anymore because they kind of faded into obscurity. They were kind of like cheap entertainment. And so to have this novel parody them, I don't get it as a parody because I haven't read anything like it that it's what it's parodying, but it is still humorous because it's got that satirical edge and because it's, in a very modern way for when it was written and published, it's aware of the fact that it's a book, and it's aware of the fact that the audience is clued into this as well. So one of the really enjoyable jokes is that for some reason the protagonist hates the names Seth and Reuben specifically. Like the premise of this is that she, honestly I can't remember why, I can't remember what the inciting incident is, but she inherits or goes to live at Cold Comfort Farm, and she needs to slowly acclimate to and befriend and get used to living on this farm with a bunch of characters who initially are sad, but slowly she warms up to each of them and, you know, improves their life in some way. It's a really kind of archetypal, classic sort of narrative. But early on, the 2 brothers, the 2 farmhands, are named Reuben and Seth, and she writes to a friend or a confidant. She says, I hope their names are not Reuben and Seth. And they happen to be exactly that. Like, those little moments that remind you that you're not reading a realistic novel, you're reading something that is meant to be over the top and kind of delightful in that own way, where coincidences and surprises and just little dips out of reality are frequent. that helps the novel to be a bit more enjoyable. So there are lots of funny moments. I did chuckle a few times just at how on the nose things were, but there are also times when I can feel the novel's trying to tell a joke, but the jokes don't land because it's written too long ago and the values just don't work the same way. So the confidant for protagonist's name is Flora. The confidant for Flora is super racist. Like, it's written. I can't even say it's written at a time when this is excusable, because it's not. It's written really kind of after the heydays of the British Empire. But the attitude they have towards traveling the world and meeting people of different cultures is pretty terrible from today's standards. And I feel like that's an experience you get with reading a lot of novels from the Victorian era, and immediately after that, you kind of just brush that off. I hate to say that, but it really is. Like, you look at the merit aside from the racism, it is what it is. But if you know that, the character comedy is really good. I like that the premise of the novel is effectively, we get these very one-dimensional characters. We get characters who you meet and you think they're a stereotype, and after Flora talks to them and gets to know them, she effectively makes two-dimensional characters into three-dimensional characters based on the way that she asks them questions, gives them suggestions, invites them to open up to their life in a way that it wasn't before. And to describe it that way, this novel's really good. It has a fantastic structure for a comic novel. It has not very high stakes, but enough to keep you going. It has lots of characters that each have their own foibles, and you do kind of get to like them over the course of it. But on the other hand, this narrative structure reminded me a lot of A Town Like Alice, and that novel, when I reviewed it, reminded me of colonialism, because it really was this very British voice going into Australia and making it as much like Britain as possible. And I do see a similar thing happening here, where Flora is modern. She's, I want to say, from London, something like that, and going into the countryside and bringing it into 20th century England. Is it weird to say that she's colonizing the place? Because that's how it feels sometimes. It feels like she's correcting these characters, and me and my postmodern analysis hat, I hate that I have that. I hate that I can't take those glasses off. But me reading it from the 21st century really does look into it and think, well, maybe these characters didn't need fixing, right? Maybe there were certain things about them that, I don't know, maybe progress isn't a straight line. This is just something that I really need to shake, because it stops me from enjoying books like this. And so my enjoyment of it, I would put it at a 3 out of 5. Like, I can see structurally the things that are good about it. I can see moments that I really do laugh out loud and have fun with it. But the implications behind it, it really is the kind of read and forget about it after kind of novel. So yeah, it's okay. It's alright. If you're someone who wants to get into comic writing, I think it's a wonderful novel to study. And it's surprisingly well paced for how difficult it was to get into the first time I tried reading it. But aside from that, yeah, it's fine. It's okay. Number 3, my short story collection is The Elephant Vanishes by Haruki Murakami. I'm familiar with a few of these stories because I did use a few of them when I was teaching. The second degree text is the one that I use the most often, and a few of these do also have connections to his earlier novels. So this collection, I think, was published around or maybe a little bit after Norwegian Wood. So the Wind-Up Bird Chronicle was published, and the whole like Wild Sheep's Chase sequence had been published at the time. And so the style of Murakami was quite established, but we hadn't seen the longer and more complex works from later in his career. And the feeling I get when reading his novels reminds me a lot of the feeling when reading his earlier works. His preoccupations are still the same. He loves music. He has an incredibly clean prose style that just makes me read it so fast. And very rarely do I say the amount of description is correct or perfect, because to me that's a matter of taste. But in this book, it really is perfect. Like, the pacing just matches the amount of description so well that it's just completely seamless when you read it. You never feel like, oh, we're in description now, oh, the plot's moving now. It's just, this is the way that would have made sense to write. And that's something that I recognize takes a lot of skill, but it doesn't always feel like it. And so I do appreciate Murakami's writing style for just being so accessible. And it reminds me of a period of time when I was younger, and a lot of my friends who continued reading after high school, they read a lot of Murakami. And I think the reason for it is that he's a surprisingly accessible writer who's literary, but also very easy to get through. He uses techniques that go beyond just very simple, how do I phrase it, right? Like popular fiction. He makes you feel a little bit intellectual sometimes, but it's also, there's not much bite or challenge to his works because they are so easy to read, because his characters are well defined, because he has the right amount of description. Like, there's no deliberate misleading of the audience. Do I agree with that? Or at least the amount of this deliberate misleading of the audience is palatable. I don't feel like I'm at odds with this work, which is nice. The stories themselves, to me, are a bit hit and miss. There are a few that are very memorable, and a few that it's kind of a vibe. Like the early Murakami vibe is very clear. You're in the city, you're in Tokyo, you're emotionally disenchanted, and you meet a bunch of strange people who may or may not also be emotionally disenchanted. You have fun encounters with strange people, and then the ending's a bit of a fizzle. And to the extent that you like that, this book is just a large number of those very quickly. And to the extent that that would be exhausting to you, it's just more exhausting. So I liked Dance Dance Dance, I liked Norwegian Wood. I like those books, I guess, for the moments of... Often they had this like chase or lingering hope to them. And that's just more abridged in these short stories because of the way that they are written for a different medium. So I would give this collection a 3 out of 5. There are some really good standout stories here. I particularly liked the... Okay, look back at the list of stories I remember. The second bakery attack is the one that I remember the most, but maybe because I've read it the most times. But I do like that story still. But aside from that, I don't know what I recommend it. I don't know. I think I would recommend his novels over the short story collection. Read one or two of the short stories. You can find it in a library just to get a sense of the vibe. But do you really need to experience all of this? Only if you love the style. Only if you love Murakami, and only if you can very easily forgive the things that can be annoying about him. So kind of his detached look on reality and his very negative attitude towards women. Not every story has these particular issues, but enough of them do that I'm often reminded of it. So there we go, 3 out of 5. Okay, book number 4 is Made Me Cry, Regeneration by Pat Barker. So the first in a trilogy of novels about World War I. I didn't realize it, but they're not, well, this one at least, is not set in the war front. It is set in a Scottish mental health ward where they were treating soldiers that came back from the war front that had various forms of PTSD, but that was a very new discovery at the time, coinciding with Freudian theories of psychoanalysis. These ideas of how do we treat soldiers and what are we treating soldiers for? Because the protagonist, who's kind of cheat here, William Rivers, he's a psychiatrist who's it's established very early on that his motivation is to get the soldiers back to the war front because that is what's more important at this time. And so the question of how to make them better is a bit difficult when ultimately better means sending them to the thing that gave them the stress and the trauma in the first place. So it's an interesting moral question that they have here, and largely on your attitude of war or whether war is justified, this is a very strong anti-war book, and it works quite well to that effect. We don't have a lot of soldiers here, but we have a couple that are different enough that we do get a sense of variety. Like, we see different soldiers, different attitudes to the war. We meet Siegfried Sassoon and Wilfred Owen, two very famous poets that came out of World War I, and so if you know a bit of the history of that era, then you do kind of gain more out of it. Like, we do see the process of them compose poetry, which is a bit of like a nerdy bonus if you're into that. But we also have fictionalized characters. So the psychiatrist is a real person, but there's a lot of fictionalized soldiers who wind up in his care, and to me, I feel like the psychology is very believable. I feel like the depictions of PTSD, the way the characters speak and have trouble interacting with the world because of what they experience, to me feels very believable. The novel's written in a very engaging and ornate way. There's a lot of dialogue, and the pace is deliberately slowed down, I feel like, to reflect the peacetime of the setting, but also to surprise the reader whenever we do flash back to the war. It can be very gruesome, and so that jarring transition adds to that feeling of tension. So even though it's not a novel about physically being at the war, you do feel the haunting presence of the war very clearly. I think it's one of the better ways that I've seen war writing done, is that it's very human. The structure of it allows the author to talk about the war without providing that sense of thrill that tends to come with battlefield depictions. We don't ever get to boil things down into the good guys and the bad guys and how do we win the war. It's more a case of, are our actions right, and are we doing right by the people that we should really care about? So the complexities are there, and it's done really well, and there is towards the end, incredibly harrowing scene that just puts into perspective how psychology and psychiatry has changed over time. I'm often quite surprised at how new the field of psychology and psychiatry are, that we didn't really treat mental health as something that was curable, or the methods that we were using were, today, to look back at that, quite horrifying. So for this to work as historical fiction and to put that contrast at the forefront, I think it works really well. I don't think it's a book that deliberately tries to make you cry. The subject matter is very sad. The topics handled are very serious, but I also felt by the end of it, it was more of an intellectual exercise, at least for me. Maybe because I am personally so far removed from World War I. I don't have any family that had any connection to it as far as I know. So I've never really talked to people older than me about it in a way that would, draw upon my ancestral connections, that would make me feel like personally invested in that historical period. It's a weird way to put it, but it's also something I often think about, because war novels, and especially World War I and World War II, are so popular in fiction, and I wonder if that's because a lot of European authors feel that personal connection where I don't so strongly. But that aside, I still think it's done really well. I think it will make you cry if you see people that you're familiar with in these situations, whether it is family or whether it is a personal connection to any kind of military conflict. This can be something that's very powerful. And then there's 2 more books that I will work my way through as well. So I would give this a 4 out of 5. Alright, last one, Milkman by Anna... Okay, last one, Milkman by Anna Burns. This is the Booker Prize winner of 2018. And a really, really fantastic book. So I often try to look at the reviews of the books after I read them, just trying to get a sense of if I fall in the consensus or not. This book, and a lot of Booker Prize winners actually, tend to fall within the 3.5 out of 5. And they often are quite divisive to the wider book buying crowd. I think it's interesting how the Booker Prize elevates one book every year, and people who normally wouldn't pick something like this up end up reading it and having their opinion on it. So whether it stands up to a wider critical consensus and judgment, I don't really know. All I can say is I personally really, really like this. So this book is set in an unnamed country where all the characters are also unnamed. We have the protagonist, who we only know as Middle Sister, and she ends up being stalked by this man who's quite older than her, who she only knows as Milkman, even though he's not really a milkman, that's what everyone calls him. So the setting mirrors and is quite close to the conflict within Northern Ireland, and a lot of the things that would be familiar to that conflict, whether it is questions about religion or divisions between families, or even the relationship with the Greater United Kingdom. Here in this book is referred to the place over there, or across the water, I think is the phrasing. The connection is there, but the distancing that's made, so there's an effort made to not explicitly say this. It makes me wonder how much the reader is supposed to read the troubles into this narrative, because it also works quite well as a kind of standalone magic realist novel with no historical connection or context, and it's still very powerful that way. But I think it's also useful as a reflection how it would feel like to live through a conflict like that. And so I'm not well versed enough in Irish literature or Irish history to really make a statement upon this. All I can say is that the construction of the setting is really good and believable, and the stakes created through a setting so fraught with violence and conflict works really, really well. And I think that the combination of really quite stark and scary events, like being stalked by the Milkman, contrasting with surprisingly twisted everyday events. So one that really surprises me and is memorable to me is that early on the protagonist is going to a French class, and in French they're trying to explain different languages or different colors in the way that you describe the sky, and the students get up in arms because they don't see any point in saying anything other than the sky is blue, regardless of what color the sky has to be, right? Like, there's no point in making flowery descriptions of sunsets or anything, because that's just not relevant to their existence. And so the students stage this revolt and start chanting, the sky is blue, the sky is blue. And that's one of those moments which is very emblematic of life under this kind of conflict, is that it becomes very survival based. It becomes very, here are the behaviors that you need to keep a low profile, to keep yourself safe. It's not spoken of explicitly. Instead, it's just street smarts. Like, it's knowledge that you don't share, but everyone kind of has. And if you ever fall out of that, orthodoxy in a way, like if you suddenly become abnormal to everyone around you, then you stand out drastically. And so that becomes the core conflict of this novel, is that now that the protagonist is being stalked by somebody, it changes the way everyone looks at her and speaks about her. And so now we have multiple threads running, which are all quite high stakes and thrilling. We have what is eventually going to happen with the Milkman, and we also have how does this affect the safety of the protagonist in the society where everyone has rumors about everything. So every page and every sentence is pushing on this very tense narrative, but it's also building this world, and I was just really hooked the whole way through. I thought it was told incredibly well. The issues that it raises are both prescient and important, but also handled in a way that dodges the assumptions the audience would make regarding this. So even looking at the blurb, if it was just described as a book about a woman being stalked by a menacing man, there's a way that you think the story will go, and it ends up spreading into a lot of different directions and territories that you wouldn't expect, but still follow the same themes. Like, it's hard to describe without giving too much away, but I do like the way that the plot's constructed. The characters are well done. I can see why people don't like it. I can see why it's a bit divisive, but to me the experimentation really worked, and it's a good example of what I really like in a book prize winner. Something that to me shows me a side of fiction that I haven't seen before, that gives me a new style of writing that I can appreciate without having to, I guess, without being an affront to my reading style or my preferences, and yet also saying something that's very important about the world or about people. I just appreciate it a lot. I would give it a 5 out of 5. I would recommend it, but with the caveat that for various reasons you might really not like this book. Okay, so there are my 5 books of August. Hopefully a quicker video this month. I do want to still go back and make a video about the Iliad and the Odyssey. It's been almost a month maybe almost 2 months since I finished reading those. But I then do want to lead into Ulysses. And I am about 200 pages now into Ulysses, and surprisingly not hating it, or not bouncing off it. Like, I'm getting through it, which is good. But so far, reading this month has been very fulfilling. Like, I do enjoy it all. It's been good. Anyways, I will see everyone next month or soon. We'll see how things go.